Thank you. It's an honor. It's a privilege to be here at this forum for ideas worth spreading. And what I want to talk about is basically how ideas spread. How does an idea take flight? How does an idea become a movement? And how does a ripple become a wave, a snowflake, an avalanche? And to start off, like while we start, my vantage point on this, my locus standi on this is the fact that I've handled corporate strategy and early stage P&Ls across 6 Tata Group companies, followed by HCL, then Philips, then eBay, and now with Uber. And before Uber, I was trying to scale my own startups. I was trying to consult other startups. And I've seen some of these seeds grow into huge banyan, like, like internet, for instance, or ride sharing, for instance. And I've also seen a lot of this, like MVNOs and digital radio and visual radio and satellite radio and, broadband over power lines, entertainment over broadband. There's a whole bunch of ideas which just went straight from adolescence, a very promising adolescence, to obsolescence. And what happens in between is kind of so interesting that at some point I had ambitions to write this book, which I would call The Island of Lost Ideas. And it had a very poetic beginning where there's these 2 large land masses called if and is. Is the world that we stay in, as in the world of reality, and if is the world of possibilities, of hopes, of concepts and ideas, and how a lot of these ideas don't make it across the huge long flight from if to is. And what happens in between is what I want to talk about. And I'm going to take very popular examples that I think all of you know about. So in December 2001 was this iconic product called the Segway that was launched. And Dean Kamen went on record saying, the inventor, said this is going to do to the car what the car did to the horse buggy. And the investor, John Doerr, said this is going to be the fastest company to reach $1 billion. It's going to be bigger than the internet. And Steve Jobs went and he said, this is as big a deal as a PC is. The first 3 Segways were auctioned off for $100,000 a piece. The price was just $4,000. The target was to sell 100,000 units in the first year. I think they sold about 6,000 the first 2 years. The next generation sales were even poorer. So the so-called movement was just a nice toy. One of the most ambitious projects ever on passenger transport was the Concorde. And it used to fly at twice the speed of sound, do transatlantic in 3.5 hours. It won design contests and quests, like even after it was discontinued. And it is so big, but it was $8,000 to fly, a round trip, which was 30 times the price of a low-cost option to do that. Lots of reasons why it didn't fly, and some of which you should read about. But what you would know is that about 90% of these reasons were preventable. You could have gone back at that time and predicted a sonic boom issue and predicted the cost issue and so on. They were predictable. And while I say this, I must also acknowledge that the whole bunch of ideas which have scaled, which are super popular today, aren't necessarily good ideas. So if you believe in ecology, then these sprawling lawns that you have in front of buildings aren't a great idea. Toilet paper is not a great idea. The QWERTY keyboard is not necessarily the best way to navigate and text. But these are ideas which have not just scaled, but stood the test of time and are probably still scaling today. So when I say good and bad, I want to clarify that I'm not talking about good versus evil of ideas. A lot of evil ideas like fascism or like terrorism, they've also scaled for a whole variety of reasons. I'm talking about just the idea's potential to scale. Okay, so, and the first thing I want to leave you with is that when we talk about this, no model in the world talks about guaranteed success or failure of an idea. So an extremely stupid idea can succeed, an extremely great idea can fail for a whole variety of reasons. What we're talking about is how can we influence the ultimate probability of success or scaling of an idea? How can I reduce the chances of failures? And there, some of our ideas will fail despite whatever we do. The first learning that I have is on assumptions. I think all of these people in the room, they've all made business plans, right? I mean, we know that what goes wrong in a plan is not the maths of it, It's just addition, multiplication, right? All of you can do it really well. Excel does it really well, by the way. What goes wrong is this sheet number 2 called assumptions. Just behind the cover sheet. Like that's two different companies looking at the same data will make different assumptions about the future. So one like eBay would imagine that more sellers would contest the price and the price will come down. And a company like Amazon would probably say, I'll reduce the number of sellers, so quantity per sellers will go up, and therefore he'll be able to give me a better price. But who makes wrong assumptions, right? Not experts. But then a lot of these experts got the dot-com bust entirely wrong. Most of them aren't able to predict stock market busts when they happen. So the first gorilla to cross the Atlantic was this female gorilla called Madame Ningo, who was transported from the French Congo to the New York's Bronx Zoo. And they fed her a lot of fancy stuff. They gave her a lot of, nearby restaurants were used to service food for that. And she refused to eat. She just didn't eat for 2 weeks, and then she died. And the zoo director wrote in his diary that, the stubborn animal deserved to die because of its obstinacy. Now, because she closely resembled a human, and because of her huge canines that suggested, the mandibles of a carnivore, nobody knew that gorillas were herbivores. That's the primary reason she died. The whole fairness cream market in India exploded at some point, right? It used to be small, unorganized for the longest time, and big companies didn't take steps towards it. It became huge, like in the mid-1950s. And then by the time we were in the early 2000s, 45 years later, when 1/3 of the users were men, the people on the road used to talk about it and joke about it. That's when the first company took a step to launch a men's fairness cream. So all these expert companies and people, they took a long time. So one must always question what you assume. And my second lesson is around repercussions. So in the Yellowstone Park in the 1800s, they started hand feeding the elk because tourists came for the elk and the elk population swelled. And they started eating more of these aspen trees and the tree population fell. And those trees were used by beavers to build dams. So there were no more dams, and those pools that the dams made were used by trout to lay eggs. So there was no more trout. And the second reason that tourists used to come to that park was because of trout. In another very famous example, Chairman Mao ordered the culling of all sparrows in China, saying that they eat grain, but they also eat locusts. So Locust Invasion happened, 45 million people died. And it boiled down to asking so a lot of strategy, like it's about really, really simple stuff. It's asking yourself, like the first question you ask yourself is what if? And the second question, which is possibilities. The second question is if then, which is consequence. But the third question is then what? Which is the second layer of what happens, which is, ironically called the ripple effect. And in terms of my third, and I think probably the most important question learning is about questions. I can guarantee you the wrong question will never give you the right answer. I launched spectacles for Titan and I went on the street. I found agencies asking questions like, here's a pair of sunglasses for 50,000 rupees, would you buy it? Wrong question. Intent to buy is fundamentally flawed. So how many pairs of sunglasses do you buy? At what price points did you buy them? Better question. So if you give the former question to a market research agency, by the way, whose incentives are linked to telling you there's a huge market, so they get more work, you're going to get, something like a Concorde at the end of it. It's not going to fly. And when we were in Philips and we used to worry about, for instance, brand licensing televisions, a lot of people said television is Philips. When you say Philips, everybody says television, everybody says light bulb. I said, yeah, but when you say television, people don't say Philips. People don't get up in the morning saying, I want to buy something from Philips and maybe that's a television. They wake up in the morning thinking, I need a television. So it's very, very critically important. When our share in juicers were going down, we said we're doing everything right, what's happening? Then we said, no, share's up, the category is going down. Because what was happening at that point is the sale of packaged juice was going up. So the need was not for a juicer at all, it was for juice. You research this further and you find that the need is not juice, need is something called refreshment, in which case cola is your competition, or it's something called health, in which case dairy-based drinks are competition. So the closer you peel the onion, the better your questions get. The Pebble CEO is famous for saying that at CES. He said, I'm not worried about big tech. I'm worried about people not wanting to wear watches. So who's your competition? Then who's your customer? Very famous question, like, do you know your customer really well? I was in eBay, I researched it. My customer and the Amazon customer were the same guy in different states of need. And that is difficult. You have to be careful of, management jargon too, and to ask the correct questions. And at the point of questions, the last thing I want to say is be conscious of your biases too. While the popular story is about the Russian winter defeating Napoleon, there is another very popular theory, which is his intolerance for truth. So if generals came up to him and saying that people are deserting and we're losing, these battles, he would fire them or demote them. So he stopped getting the truth. So you must be also careful of biases when you ask questions. And in the end, you'll find a lot of questions, right? I mean, did WebVan fail because it was too early or because of the dot-com bust? Did Napster fail because it could not handle legislation too well? Pets.com, did it fail because it spent too much in the Super Bowl and so on? So there'll be a long debate on all of these failures, right? But I want to tell you one of my favorite quotes from this guy called George E.P. Boggs, a statistician who used to say that all models are wrong. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And therefore, I want to leave you with how a lot of these companies and startups, think about innovation, and that's a rough model that a lot of people I know use consciously or unconsciously. And we rarely start with inspiration, okay? So we start mostly with data. Because inspiration is beautiful, but it's rare, and it could be dangerous at times because it's not vetted. It's just one person's inspiration. We get data from the market, the competition, the industry, and then we use internal data like marketing and finance and supply chain and production. And we try and look at where the market gap is. Where is the customer willing to pay some money for, and where is an unfulfilled need? Because like me and Satyat were talking in the morning, disruptions don't happen because of new technologies. They happen because of unmet needs of customers. Right? So that's what we try to identify and bring it to an insight, which is as simple as saying this product or platform or solution is going to fill that void. And once we do that is the important part of asking questions, connecting to what we talked about earlier. What are the critical success factors of this market? What are my strengths? Is there a match here? Do I want to end up like a Cisco who bought this iconic product, a gadget called Flip, and realized that they're a completely B2B company and they didn't know what to do with it? So $600 million was spent buying Flip, and 2 years later it was closed down. We want to talk about sizing also, right? And between validation and sizing, there's a lot of other stuff. Like you'll ask yourselves questions around the product market fit. You'll ask questions around as basically reasons to believe. Yeah, if somebody says this is my market size, what is the reason to believe that it's going to happen? If you think you're going to gain share from others, where's your relative NPS versus your competition, right? Unless that's there, your share's not going to happen. And sizing is complicated by a lot of people, but I think it's as simple as asking 100 people, assuming they're representative of your market, how many of you feel this need, which is incidence, and intensity. How much will you pay to get this need fulfilled or this problem go away, right? So there's sizing, but remember it's need. Remember what Segway got wrong was not technology. The technology works. What it got wrong is identification and sizing of these need states. And eventually after that, it's a simple step of resourcing, but it's also about ring fencing those resources. So you put people, money and time behind these ideas, but you don't want to do, you end up in a situation like Kodak was, where this great idea of digital photography, I mean, it's changed fundamentally the way we create, consume and share digital memories, including this conversation, I'm sure will be consumed digitally, 100%. But it threatened another part of the company. In Philips, we had to create an innovation fund focused on Africa because we found Philips was coming in the way of Philips in terms of dealing with that problem. And in the end, it's go to market. I won't belabor this. A lot has been said about this, but I just want to mention one fact, which is my favorite. I call it the escalator problem. Just because it's easy for you doesn't mean that it's easy for everybody else. I can't tell a person who's first timer on the escalator that go get on, nothing happens, like you'll get out. A lot more handholding is needed. In eBay, when we're trying to convert the first customers, we realize customers in India haven't had the necessary previous step of catalog shopping. We weren't used to taking a look at a picture and a description and making a buying decision. Buying was about, picking up the article, weighing it, touching it, feeling it, arguing, bargaining, comparing. And this experience was just dehuman for them. It was like something that they had to find really, really tough. But at the end of it, right, when you tie all of these learnings together, and lots of, like we said, like there's a lot of constructive, destructive interference which could make the difference between the ripple turning into a wave or not. I want to end with one sobering thought, which is that I can give you 100% guarantee of an idea's inability to scale if you have forgotten the idea, if you've not tried the idea, if you've not put your shoulder behind that idea, if you've not ring-fenced resources, or in other words, if you haven't really, like you want to be a novelist, for instance, but you haven't set aside that 2 hours every week to sit down and write. It's never going to happen. So it's one thing to have a dream, and it's another thing to see that dream coming to shape. And I think having a good idea is a great joy, but having a great idea is almost a responsibility. See, an idea is a powerful thing, and it's a beautiful thing, it's precious. People have lost their lives for ideas. Copernicus waited till his deathbed, like 30 years he waited before the publication of his ideas by Osiander. Moments before he died, it got published. Giordano Bruno and Galileo lost their lives for the same idea of the whole heliocentric theory and so on. But we are at a very momentous point in the history of mankind, right? Far from persecution of idea, we're in this wild pursuit of ideas. We worship ideas. Like forums like these have been called the millennial answer to the church. And in these times, right, I'm sure all of you have ideas. I'm sure you guys have stood on a pavement that said they should, this morning I was telling somebody they should either redesign jeans or wallets. Something's wrong, it's not fitting in. Or sometimes, we've stood outside our own office and said, look at all this real estate. It's empty in the nights, nobody uses it. And it's just legislation which is stopping it to happening. People have I know, sat down in bathtubs and said, my bathtub doesn't have a flow valve. How difficult is that? My bathtub overflows. Imagine the waste. They say that my iron doesn't have, a digital temperature control. Geysers have it now. I think when you have these ideas or any else that you're thinking about, my first request to you is write it down. Don't underestimate that. Write it down, because someday you're going to need an idea, then you can open your diary and get back to it. And the second is to consider some of what we spoke about today. And I really hope some of that is useful and some of that comes handy one day when you build your own wave. Thank you so much.